In the previous video, we discussed the European Union and ended with the policies of the European Union and the European market system. Next, we will discuss the theory of optimal currency areas. The theory of optimal currency areas was developed by Robert Mundell, a Canadian economist, in 1961. The theory of optimal currency areas argues that the optimal time for a system of fixed exchange rate or common currency is one that is highly integrated economically. This means free trade in goods and services, the free flow of financial and physical capital, and the free and easy flow of labor through migration and immigration. The theory discusses the benefits and costs of joining a fixed exchange rate regime, and that there is an optimal point in the model to do so. As you will see later, this is similar to the demand and supply theory that you are already used to. One of the benefits of joining a fixed exchange rate regime is to avoid uncertainty and international transaction costs that are involved with the floating exchange rate. The gain that would occur is if a country joins a fixed exchange rate system is called the monetary efficiency gain. This gain will depend on the level or amount of economic integration between the country that wishes to join and the other countries that have already joined. It will be beneficial to a country to join the fixed exchange rate regime if trade between the countries are extensive and the transaction cost would be greatly reduced. Financial assets flow freely between it and the member countries because the uncertainty about rates of return that is reduced under a fixed exchange rate regime. And third, people migrate freely between it and the member countries because the uncertainty of the purchasing power of wages is greatly reduced. Again, compare these benefits to the level of economic integration and policies involved in it. Therefore, graphically, the benefit of joining the fixed exchange rate regime increases when the degree of economic integration increases. It is therefore a positive sloped curve between the monetary efficiency gain on the y-axis and the degree of economic integration on the x-axis between the joining country and the exchange rate area. Again, as the degree of economic integration increases on the x-axis, the monetary efficiency gain for the joining country increases, a positive slope, called the GG curve, GG for gain. There are also costs to joining the fixed exchange rate regimes. These costs include the loss of monetary policy for stabilizing output and employment. Remember the internal stability discussed in week 9. Joining the fixed exchange rate regime will also lose the automatic adjustment of exchange rate to changes in aggregate demand. We define this loss that would occur if a country joined a fixed exchange rate system as the economic stability loss. This too depends on the economic integration between the country that wishes to join and the countries that have already joined the region. If, after joining a fixed exchange rate system, the new member faces falling aggregate demand, this will lead to relative prices falling. Financial assets and labor will migrate to the areas with higher returns and wages. The loss of the automatic adjustments of flexible exchange rate is therefore not as great if goods and services markets are integrated economically. Therefore, the cost of joining a fixed exchange rate regime decreases when the degree of economic integration increases. Therefore, it is a negative slope between the monetary efficiency loss for a country joining and the degree of economic integration between the joining country and the exchange rate area. So, if the degree of economic integration increases, the economic stability loss for the joining country decreases. a negative slope. We call this the LL curve for economic stability loss. When we combine the GG graph and the LL of the GG graph of gains and the LL curve of losses, we find the optimal or critical point of joining a fixed exchange rate region. In our case, this is point 1. The optimal degree of economic integration is therefore theta 1, Greek symbol theta 1. To the left of this point, the losses exceed the gain, and to the right of point 1, the gains exceed the loss. Therefore, countries join anywhere from theta 1 to the right, where the degree of economic integration increases. We can also expect changes in this optimal point, like when there's a change in the aggregate demand in the country joining. If aggregate demand changes, the economic stability loss would be greater for every measure of economic integration between the new member and the existing members of a fixed exchange rate system. How would this affect the critical point where the monetary efficiency gain equals the economic stability loss? If the economic stability loss of joining the fixed exchange rate system increases, the LL curve will shift to the right or upward from LL1 to LL2. This shift causes the critical point to move from point 1 to point 2. The degree of economic integration therefore needed is now theta 2. A higher level of economic integration is needed than before. We now turn to the question of whether the European Union is an optimal currency union. If the EU or EMS, Economic and Monetary Union, can be expected to benefit members, then we expect that its members would have a higher degree of economic integration. This would include large trade volumes as a fraction of GDP between members, a large amount of foreign financial investment and foreign direct investment relative to total investment, and a large amount of migration across borders as a fraction of the total labor force. The evidence on these points point to the contrary. There are widely divergent unemployment rates across the European Union. Although these rates moved closer together after the launch of the euro in 1999, since the late 2000s, and especially since the Great Recessions, these have moved sharply apart again. There are wide price differences and ranges in goods and services between European countries. For example, the price of the same BMW car varies between the Netherlands and Germany by 25%. Regional migration is not extensive in the EU. Europe has many languages and cultures which hinder migration and labor mobility. Unions and regulations also impede labor movements between industries and currencies. Europe is therefore not an optimum currency area. Therefore, the asymmetric economic developments within the different countries of the Eurozone will remain hard to handle through monetary policy. It also requires fiscal policy. In most European Union countries, labor markets remain highly unionized and subject to employment taxes and regulations that impede labor mobility between industries and regions. The result has been persistently high levels of unemployment. Unless labor markets become more flexible, individual Eurozone countries will have a hard time adjusting towards full employment and competitive real exchange rates. Other structural problems are also abound. Before we end for this week, here are some of South Africa's current trade agreements and the level of economic integration. The highest level of economic integration is the South African Customs Union between South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Swaziland. It involves products that flow between all of these countries. You can read through the list, through the others, and refer to the full list on eCanva. You see we have the Customs Union, Free Trade Agreements, and preferential trade agreements. Given the discussion of the theory of optimum currency areas and the evidence from Europe, evaluate the viability of Africa becoming a fixed exchange rate region and the steps that it would involve to be successful. Think of the problems that Europe has faced in the Great Recession and the different trade volumes, foreign direct investment, and migration that would be required.